There you go.
I think you should have used
being recorded over there.
Over there? I'll control the computer? Or you
But you want that off
want to sit?
I don't want to stand over there all the time.
Okay.
Just like it's not really good room for two presenters.
Not really good room for two presenters. I'll stand over there.
You can stand over there. I'll do the computer if you want.
Okay, yeah, mouse is in the right position.
It's the same type of printing as your printing insurance, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, this was like one class to get into the
How are there no keyboard controls for this?
There might be keyboard controls.
It's ridiculous.
I got the little clicker, the Logitech clicker. It doesn't work on Macs.
If you want to do black and white,
building the commerce tech firm in South Carolina. He's doing like acids thing.
yes,
When you started?
you don't have
Like three right?
It's not
Close the door.
like for anybody who walks in and
Go right to the principal's office right now.
I mean, kill the light.
Yeah?
I can read.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Everybody see the screen? Cool. All right. Okay, everybody, welcome to building an API with Drupal that people will actually use. I'm David Playtech, Senior Developer at Acquia. I'm the Neon Lobster on Drupal.org, Twitter, and everywhere else on the internet.
And I'm Matt Grasmick. I'm a technical consultant, also at Acquia. 1 second.
All right, so during the session, we are going to talk about how to build an API, what the best practices for implementing an API are, how to implement an API using Drupal, and how to support your app developers who are going to be implementing your API to build various applications.
So it's worth noting that the first half of this presentation is really about APIs in general and not about Drupal. And then we'll talk about Drupal when we get a little bit further into it.
So what is an API? APIs are really big these days. Everybody seems to be creating them. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Everybody has an API that application developers can use to expose third-party data. That's essentially what an API does. It allows your application to expose your data to other developers who want to build applications on top of it and customize the output.
So just some examples of popular APIs you guys are probably familiar with. Facebook, Twitter, Google, you've probably all used mobile apps that sit on top of these APIs. So why should you API all the things? What's the point? First of all, it expands the reach of your data, so a lot more people can access it. And it also expands the ability of your data to be implemented in other applications. So you build a website, you've got data, if you want it to be available on a phone or an iPad or an e-reader or something like that, it's great for it. Another great feature is crowdsourcing feature development. So if you put all your data out there, a lot of other developers can build things you never thought of, or they might go into your issue queue and give suggestions for ways that you can use your data that you hadn't thought of. So since we're in DC, it's worthwhile to talk about APIs and the relationship with government. Some of you may know that the White House issued a directive that requires all federal agencies to have a public programming interface, and it also has set the default state of applicable government data to be open and machine readable. And what that means is that a lot of the federal agencies in DC are chomping at the bit for a way to expose their data. And Drupal, as you all know, is big around here, and it's a great way to do that.
So what is a good API? In order to answer that question, you really have to think about the users of your API, which namely are going to be other developers. Other developers are going to expect that your API has a consistent and functional interface that they can easily query and get expected results from. Your API should support multiple request formats, should support multiple response formats, and it should be fully and completely documented so that developers can figure out exactly how to communicate with your API, and what features it enables. You should also ideally plan for the future and not pull the rug out from your developers in the future.
So for the context of this presentation, we're talking about RESTful APIs, which are sort of the most popular kind of API right now. So I want to talk about what REST is for a second. It's an architectural style. It's not a standard, and it's not a protocol. So there aren't any conventions that get together and make rules for it. But some of the salient features of this style are that you provide stateless data, which means that you provide data that is cacheable, and it happens over a client-server relationship. It's a back and forth. In 99% of the times when we talk about RESTful APIs, we're talking about going over the HTTP protocol, but you don't necessarily have to. It's a style that can apply to any kind of protocol, but that's an assumption that's built in here. So let's talk about specifics about what makes a good API. Your developers are primarily communicating with your API by going to a URL and asking for data or sending data to it. So it's really important that you think about the way you're structuring your URLs. You want to make sure that you have patterns that logically represent your data, and they also do that simply and semantically in such a way that it makes the underlying technology invisible. So if you've got an API you built on Drupal, the people consuming your API shouldn't need to know what a node is. They shouldn't need to know what Drupal is. They shouldn't necessarily need to know PHP. It should be logically represented, and they can use whatever language or system they're comfortable with to take that data and create a different implementation.
So the experts in the field have come out with various standards that everybody exposing API should probably follow. Apogee, if anyone's aware of the service provider, has come out with a variety of free ebooks that you can download from their website. We're going to just quickly go through what we found to be the most important rules that they inform users to support. First of all, you should define your objects granularly. Rather than having a single resource at nodes or data, if you have articles and pictures and videos, you should expose all of those resources as 3 separate URLs. This way, developers will actually be able to logically deduce exactly which resource is going to return which data that they're looking for. Also, developers don't necessarily know that you're running on top of Drupal, and so they don't necessarily know what a node is. By expecting that they're going to understand what the Drupal platform looks like, you might alienate Java developers or C# developers who don't know anything about the Drupal platform and just want to get into your data and start pulling things out. So try to logically represent all of the individual objects that you're trying to expose to your API.
Yeah, and we should mention that you did mention there's standards out there, and these are things that we found useful, but feel free to raise your hand and ask questions about these different rules that we've come up with, and you can feel free to disagree with us as well. I think we're going to go through it kind of quickly, so if you want more examples than this, we're happy to talk about that as well.
Along the same lines of defining your objects granularly, try to logically explain to users that they're going to be retrieving an entire list of data instead of just a single video. So in the first example of don'ts, we're providing a URL, just simply video. And if I were a developer making a request to that URL, I would expect a single video to be returned to me. But in reality, you're going to retrieve an entire list, an entire index of videos. So just for the sake of logic, provide a plural noun that denotes a container to developers accessing your API.
Okay, so we've talked about our URLs really representing the data that you're going to get. And keeping with that, we like to separate filtering from the URL path. And for that reason, we put filtering inside of query parameters. That way, when you look at the actual URL, API v1 videos, that entirely represents the object that you're expecting to get back. And everything afterwards, question mark, category equals funny, is about filtering the data object you're expecting to get back. If you look at an example of what you shouldn't do, I think you can see why it might be confusing. API/v1/video/funny. If a developer goes to that, it might not be obvious that there are a bunch of categories, and one of them happens to be named funny. And it might not be obvious that there isn't just a video named funny that you're going to get. So having that clear delineation makes it a lot simpler.
Go ahead.
Two questions. Are you going to put these online? These slides online?
Yeah.
Sure.
Could you do a half step?
Sure.
Thank you. Half step. Perfect.
So for the sake of keystrokes, try to keep your URLs short. If you go more than 3 layers deep, you might want to think, maybe I'm not representing my resources appropriately. Like Matt was talking about, by adding filters to your URL, you're describing your object and then adding parameters to your object. That makes it a lot easier for developers to write out applications that are going to query your API, as opposed to having to fill out an entire long list of URL paths that will actually pull back your data. So again, just try to keep your URL short.
Okay. So you should also avoid using verbs inside of the URL, and this is part of the REST architectural style, given that we're using HTTP. HTTP has verbs built into the protocol. So you guys are probably familiar with post and get when you're using a form and you're sending data over. There are also 2 other verbs that are available, put and delete, and put is really used for updating, and then we have delete. So these represent all of the CRUD operations. And since we already have those verbs and we can send them in a header request, there's no reason to complicate the URL with them. And if we use that part of the request, the header, to make it post or get, we can also reduce the number of URLs that there are in our API. So instead of having videos create or videos delete, you can send a post request to videos with data, and the API should know you're trying to create something. Or you can send a delete request to videos with an ID, and it should know that you're trying to delete something. And this next slide has a quick chart of all of the different verbs lined up with a resource. So let's say you've got a website and you're a dog breeder and you're adding dogs to your website. You've got an API for it. You only need one URL really to control dogs for the most part. So /dogs, you can create a new dog by making a post request to it. You can get a list of all the dogs by doing a GET request to that same URL, and the same for put and delete. It simplifies things a lot, and it really leverages the architecture of the web.
So response patterns are the other side of the coin. Developers are going to be making requests to your API. You're going to be providing responses, and you should also be worried. You should also be concerned about the structure of your responses. Nobody likes crappy data. Everybody wants their data to come through in a format that is easy to parse through a programming language and easy to map to various data objects. So there's a number of simple rules that you should follow when programming your response objects. Always provide IDs as an object property. Developers are going to potentially use those IDs to make requests to other resources available in your API. So rather than just simply posting a comment with a body and a created at, just simply attach the comment ID to it so that when a developer makes a request to the comment resource, they can also pass along the comment ID and get exactly the ID that they're expecting.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised how often APIs exist that don't do this, especially if you have nested objects. So, a Drupal example would be a node and a comment. And a lot of APIs, you might have a parent object with an ID and then a child object in it, but you don't get the ID for that, which means if you want to go make a request for that particular object, you need to backtrack and figure out what the relationship is.
And speaking of things that Drupal nests, try to nest all collections. A great example in Drupal for this is taxonomy terms. Rather than providing a flat list of all of your terms as a response to your object with tag IDs and tag names, instead, nest it inside of the tags object. Again, this way users will be able to easily parse through your API response, retrieve the tags and the tag values, and be able to pass those back through to other resources.
So in that case, if you're giving IDs, but they're nested objects of a different type, or they're not exactly the same, do you guys have any thoughts on some APIs that allow you to basically discover through that? So like the nested object will tell you the API to get more information about that comment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely something you should do. So I think every level of nesting should sort of be independent enough that you can use that ID and you might be able to use a separate portion of the API to get more data on that specific element.
Since the terms object is an entirely separate object, you should also be providing a terms resource that users could make a request to pass in the same ID that they just received and get a longer list of possibly all nodes tagged to that ID.
Yeah, and if you think about the developer experience here, you're probably consuming a lot of data, and then you're setting up, in PHP, all of these for each loops, and as you go down, what you don't want to have to do is not have enough data at that level of the loop to do what you're looking for and have to go back up to the parents and their properties. And that's sort of the idea of having each level has enough information to be independent. So another thing you should do is provide metadata, and a lot of APIs don't do this. So when a developer makes a request, and let's say that it doesn't go well, they should know what the error code is, and they should know what message they should show to the user on the screen. So including a status code and a developer message is really helpful for the people consuming your API. It's also helpful to have result set information. So if you're getting 1,000 videos, it's great to tell the developer where they are in this result set. You're on page 5 and I'm showing you 1,000. So they don't have to have their program calculated. And it's also very useful to return the execution time. So let's say there's a really big result set and they're trying to just grab everything. If you tell them the execution time, they have an idea of how long it's going to take per data row and how often they should set up their cron jobs. And sort of what impact that's going to have on their environment and performance. So this is, the recommendation is that this is always on top of every response, no matter what, even if it's only one row.
So now we're going to talk about actually exposing an API within Drupal.
So how many of you guys know what the services module is? How many of you have used services? All right, so it's half or maybe less than half.
So you probably already know that the services module provides a number of built-in request and response formats, including the most popular ones, JSON, JSONP, and XML. It also has built-in REST and XML RPC clients. It also has built-in authentication methods.
So an example of something that comes out of the box with services would be a slew of CRUD operations that work with the nodes you've already got in Drupal. And relationships and actions. So you can turn on services and you can easily create, read, update, and delete nodes through an API. You can leverage relationships like the node comment relationship again, so you can go through children objects via joins. And then there are various miscellaneous actions that come with it, like the ability to use the API to attach a file to the node. Or there's also targeted actions and actions in services actually. So a targeted action would be creating or attaching a file to a specific node, and then there are actions like triggering, indexing your entire search table. And this is a quick screenshot of the way that services looks with the UI module turned on. It might be too small for you all to read, but it's a list of all of the resources that come with Drupal. So, comments, files, nodes, and under each one of those, you can just really easily enable that resource and certain operations for it. So we can check node and say, I want to turn on the retrieve and create operations for this, and those will become available through an API for you.
If you want more granular control of the data that your API is exposing, you can use the Content API module. So of the group that had used services before, who's used the Content API module? Nobody. Okay. So the Content API module will allow you to expose specific parts of data for each node and other Drupal entities through your API. I'll go to the next slide. So globally, you'll be able to expose the created app values, the revised app author values, node bodies, node titles, node IDs, etc. And you can also map individual fields attached to individual content types to APIs. So if you have a field that you only want to expose on your website, but you don't want to expose through an API, you can easily deselect it through the Content API module. And conversely, if you have a field that you only want to expose through your API and not on your website, you can do that too.
Okay, so the last way you can expose data, sorry, I heard you go, wow, great, someone's interested. So another thing you can do is write your own resources. And actually, all of those rules we talked about in the first half of the presentation about structuring your URLs and putting filters and query parameters, services doesn't really do any of that out of the box. So if you want to follow those rules, you're probably going to have to use custom methods. And services provides a hook to do that really easily. So if you're familiar with hook menu, this works a lot like that. You implement the hook, and you can name the resource. So here's an example of creating the node resource, which already exists, but we'll ignore that. And you can find the callback and sort of the include files that go with that, access callbacks or permissions with the permission system, relationships, all those sorts of things. In a true Drupal fashion, it's arrays inside of arrays inside of arrays, and then you just return it.
And as I mentioned before, out-of-the-box services does include support for authentication, including Drupal session authentication, as well as OAuth authentication. And the services module also supports custom authentication methods. So if you want to write your own module and support application IDs or user IDs, services will let you do that.
2 questions. One's sort of an adjunct. This content API module. I have notes that I have special fields for code that I'm writing, but I don't want that exposed to the users. Can I use that to hide those fields rather than writing like
A custom resource.
exactly
Yeah, you can choose which fields are and are not delivered through
through the page?
Oh, repeat the question.
Oh, through the
Yes, thank you.
page?
Yes.
Hold on. The question was, if I've got my own custom content type and there are fields I don't want to show
I don't want to show in the node when the node is displayed.
in the node when it's displayed, can I do that via Content API? And
No,
then-
you want to do that inside of the content UI that Drupal provides out of the box.
So yeah, that's for the display portion, and then you can control what's displayed and not displayed in the API with Content API.
And then the second question is, there were 2 services modules when I picked the service module. Is that right? Is this going to be rolled into Drupal 8 in core?
So the question was, basically, is this functionality going to be rolled into Drupal 8? There's probably not going to be a services module for Drupal 8 because of the way that routing is handled. Hook menu is being thrown away, and basically you can route different kinds of requests at the same endpoint using the new menu system. So you're going to be able to say, if there's a post request to this URL, use this callback function. If there's a get request, use this callback function. That's a lot more flexible, so there isn't quite as much of a need for services in Drupal 8, or at least we hope not.
And there actually is a REST module for.
You would know that. Did you have a question too?
I think you kind of answered about the content API. It was about using Drupal session authentication and making sure that somebody can see like data from their user profile that maybe they shouldn't be able to see. Does content API cover every entity type, or is it just?
No, Content API is, I mean, it's probably in beta. It's not great. I don't want to give the impression that it's great. Services does that pretty well, though. Services lets you authenticate with the core Drupal user authentication system,
Right.
and ties in with the core permission systems as well. So you only see the fields that you should through that. And you can extend that further. I've got like a snippet on my blog I can post with the slides that, for instance, uses the FB OAuth module, or I think that's the name of it, that lets you authenticate via Facebook through services and then log in a user. So you can extend it really easily as well. Do we have one more question?
About service 6, which is currently site Drupal.org, because it's a security vulnerability. Do you guys know anything about what's being done there? Essentially,
I don't know. Do you know, David?
I have no idea. The last
So
time I
the-
used services for 6 was like 6 months ago, and that wasn't an
The
issue.
issue was about using session authentication. It wasn't protecting against process forgeries. There's an open issue. You know, try to fix it, but I looked
Issue
at it
queue.
briefly, someone pointed it to me. I don't think it should be that hard to fix, but
Should hunt down Dave Stoling. He's on the security team.
It's all Dave's fault.
Yeah,
Always is. So I'm going to repeat the question for the microphone real quick. The question was, do you guys know anything about the state of the Drupal 6 services module? And the answer is pretty much no. Take a look at the issue queue. So, sorry.
What's Drupal say?
I've heard of such things.
So now we're going to talk about how to generate automated documentation from your services resources with the new services documentation module
That we wrote.
that we wrote.
And you guys are free to contribute to it. Probably don't have enough time to read this XKCD comic, but it's all about supporting developers and giving good support. So that's the idea behind services documentation. We want to support developers by giving them documentation so they know what's going on in your API, giving them examples of how you can take that data and turn it into a widget or a mobile app or something like that, and also provide them with SDKs, which are great. So like a PHP or a JavaScript SDK that helps accelerate their development with your API.
So the services documentation module will automatically parse through all of your services resources and expose each resource and endpoint to a documentation page that will also include all their individual query parameters, and will allow you to attach example requests and example responses, as well as example SDKs and example widgets. And the entire module is fully themable using TPL files. Here's an example of a hooked services resources implementation, which you saw before. And now you've simply added one additional element to the array called documentation callback.
These guys.
Right down there. There's also a documentation version, but we're going to deprecate that, so we're not going to talk about that. Moving on to the next slide, you can actually see the callback that controls how the documentation page is formed. Since you're attaching a documentation callback to your services resource, you can provide a human readable name, a path, a description, a request example, and a response example to that resource. And you can easily write a function that will get the contents of your response file and spit it out onto the screen. And before I take your question, the next slide will actually show an example of this in action. So here is a user's resource, which is provided at the path users via the get method. Here's a list of all the arguments provided, as well as the description that is programmed into the services resources call, and a request example and the response that you will get from that request.
So I'm going to say some of that again in slightly different words. We've already got a hook services resources where you can make your own custom resources, right? And you've got an alter hook where you can also alter any of the resources that services comes with. And what we've basically done is made a module that lets you add a couple extra rows to the array that you're already returning with those functions. And that contains information about the documentation, like what the description of that resource is, or what an example response would be. And when services goes and crawls through all those resources that are implemented by those hooks, it's going to aggregate the documentation as well. A lot of it you don't have to specify. So the arguments and whether it's a post or a get method, all that stuff services already knows about. So it's going to generate an awful lot of this documentation for you, and you just add a couple of data points that services couldn't know about, like a description of the resource, because you just don't put that in anywhere in services. Right now this all happens in code. Something that we're working toward and that we'd like people to help us with is a UI where you have a menu. You can just type in these descriptions and responses. It'll be a little bit easier. Did you still have a question, or did we answer it?
Yeah, have you thought about putting some of that stuff in the annotation instead of the code?
What do you mean? Where in the what annotation?
So like, I've unfortunately had to work with like a Ruby REST server and Sinatra, and you basically, in the code comments, you describe the response and the format, and it automatically parses that into the documentation for that thing. And Drupal 8 is also using a lot more annotation parsing on functions and methods. So just
sort of like Doxygen.
Like within the Doxygen. So then your API module will parse it. You have the example, and your module will parse it, and you have the example in a different format without having to write the same thing twice.
So
we've gotten that question a few times.
Let me repeat the question.
Oh yeah.
So the question was, have you thought of putting the documentation and annotations in the code that could then be parsed?
In the code comments.
In the code comments, which could then be parsed and used as documentation instead of using this whole hook method.
So we've gotten that question a few times. Neither of us were aware of the ability for us to actually do that when we set out to write this module. I wasn't aware of it. You might have been aware of it.
My short answer would be, this was a lot easier than doing that. And it's kind of part of Drupal's architecture already that you have all these hooks. This hook is already getting invoked. It's easy to add just a couple things to it. And the services module already had plenty of functions built in that can just pull those arrays being returned by that hook and run through it. So this was easier than parsing annotations. That's the short answer. Okay, I haven't gone over this slide yet. So SDKs, another thing that services documentation lets you do is, in that callback, provide a link and a path and description for an SDK. So let's say you have a JavaScript SDK that developers can download, and then they can consume your API data with JavaScript. We want to make sure you get that onto the documentation page easily. So that's supported. SDKs are great. They help accelerate development, and they also help sort of decouple from the Drupal world and PHP and all the languages you're familiar with. It makes your API a lot more accessible.
In the same vein, as you can support SDKs in your documentation, you can also include additional example implementations of your API, which might include widgets or interfaces, jQuery plugins, or even mobile apps. So with the services documentation module, you can easily include a tarball of an example that you've already built out, and you can even provide an embeddable widget of your example on your documentation page that users can then download and hack and have their own custom implementation of your API. So now that you're hopefully using documentation to support your API and API developers, the other part of supporting developers is planning ahead for your API and making sure that you're not going to alienate your developers with future development of your application. So one of the things you don't want to do in the middle of building out your API is changing how everything works so that users that are consuming your data are left in the lurch and unable to continue consuming your data to build out their applications.
Yeah, this whole presentation is about not screwing developers, really. So we want to make the API easy to use with requests and responses, and don't do things like change the whole thing without telling them.
does it.
A lot of people do it. It's horrible. We've probably all felt the pain of the API changing.
So there are some general rules that you can follow in order to support developers for the lifespan of your application. One of them is to support simple minor versions. And minor versions can receive updates, but those updates should not include any modifications or deletions of existing functions. So you can add new query parameters and you can add new resources, but you shouldn't change the way any of the resources or responses are returned or received. If a developer has written an application that is expecting data to be returned in a specific format, and suddenly you change that on them, their entire application is going to break. So if you want to change the way your entire application or your entire API functions, just simply plan to release a new version. And when you plan to release a new version, which should be signaled by some sort of architectural change to the entire API, indicate to developers when the deprecation timeline will take place. So Twitter recently did this, where they gave everybody about, I think, 12 months to move from one version of their API to the next. So all application developers that built out a mobile app or a website app, the old version of the API, were given plenty of time to update all their applications before Twitter officially shut down their API. And ideally, you'll be able to support at least 2 versions of your API at any moment. Lots of institutions don't necessarily have a budget to support long-term development of any applications that they may build on top of your API. So by suddenly pulling the rug out from that organization who's already invested significant time and effort and money into building an application, you're alienating those organizations and breaking their apps. So try to support at least 2 versions of your API at any given time.
That's what Drupal does right now. So another thing we should mention, we didn't put a slide on this, but you might have noticed our URL patterns had API/v1 in all of them. So another great practice is to make it really explicit what version of the API somebody is using. So if you have a v1 for version 1 and a v2 for version 2, and you send out a big email and say, hey guys, we're retiring version 1, this endpoint's going to go away. It's really obvious what's going to stop working and what's going to keep working. Otherwise, it can get pretty confusing for the developers.
Got a question?
What would that look like with something like Drupal and services? Like if you update to the next version of Drupal and you have a completely new structure to your service or whatever, and how's
I can answer that if you want.
Well, I could say simply
But
that
I'm-
between versions of Drupal. Oh, sorry. The question was, what does a upgrade to your API look like when moving through different versions of, say, the services module or your individual API or even Drupal core? To speak to Drupal core, you would have to restructure your entire API. Hopefully, you would map all of your initial resources to the same endpoints. Within the same version of Drupal, services has the ability to construct new endpoints, and resources can be shared between endpoints. So you can simply create a new endpoint, map the same resources to the new endpoint, and add or delete any other resources that you want.
So just to give you an example, for anyone who's not familiar with services and the term endpoint, through the services UI module, you can create an endpoint like API v1. And then for that endpoint, with that base URL, you choose what resources are available. So you say node and comments are available for that endpoint. So API v1 node works, API v1 comments doesn't work. You can make another endpoint completely independent that's API v2 and assign the same or different resources to that. And from a services perspective, deprecating an expired version would just be turning off that endpoint. So it's pretty simple to do through services. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about scaling, and this is mostly outside of the Drupal context. We've worked with a lot of APIs recently, and the easiest way to scale we found is using third-party services. And this is just to make you aware of some of those third-party services. So Mashpee, Mashery, 3Scale, Apogee, all of these providers we have here essentially are API proxies. So when you use one of these services, a developer makes a request to Apogee, for instance, a proxy, and then they ferry the request over to you. You send the response to them, and then they send the response to the end user. Being the man in the middle there, they can provide a lot of really cool features for you. So they can provide authentication for you, so you don't need to worry about it. They can provide different caching mechanisms than just what's in Drupal. They can provide lots of fancy analytics. They can also provide workflows and great GUIs and all sorts of things we're not listing here. Another really cool thing that you can do using these proxies is integrate multiple APIs from different sites and make them look like they're the same API. So if you have 4 different Drupal sites, or not even Drupal, and they all have APIs that give data, you can combine all of those and have this facade where it looks like it's one API that people query. So that's really great.
And since this is DC, and some people may be working on government projects, data.gov has recently released, well, I don't know about recently, but data.gov does have their own API proxy service that will allow users to authenticate through api.data.gov. And data.gov handles all the management of API keys, so a single user can access the FEMA API as well as an API that Congress might provide. It's similar to the third-party services like Apogee or 3Scale. It's not nearly as robust, but it is something that's built on top of an open source platform that hopefully the government is going to invest more time and money into to make more robust and actually provide the same sorts of features that the third-party providers themselves do.
So it's for government clients, really, and it's free to government, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a government client that wants to expose an API, this is a really great proxy to use.
Have you guys launched any APIs on Apogee or any of the systems that you mentioned?
So
The question was, have you launched any APIs on Apogee or other third-party providers?
I recently spent a lot of time looking at Apogee and 3Scale. I was leaning towards 3Scale before discovering data.gov. 3Scale looks really good from a developer's perspective. You can jump right in there, you can start using their console, you can test everything out. It's got a great front-end user interface. The developer interface is also really good. You get statistics from both sides. Apogee is not quite as open and transparent with their release of the free developers console, so I wasn't really able to test anything out. But they do have an interesting documentation system that you can basically map all of your services resources to a WADL file, and they will build out all of your documentation and even a developer console so that they can make test requests and responses to your API. So it's possibly worth looking into.
And do those services depend on you conforming to all of the REST constraints, or do they just kind of work with whatever you
They pretty much work with what you've got. There's Apogee, for instance, has a really powerful UI where you go in and say, go to this URL, make this kind of request, expect this kind of data, return it in this format, JSON, XML, whatever, plug it into this workflow, require this particular authentication for this URL. So it's all very flexible. Apogee, for instance, lets you supply a custom XML file where you can really easily define all of those things, or use a great GUI.
Easily might be a bit of a misnomer.
Well,
it requires a WADL format.
Once you read all the documentation.
Once you read all the documentation, you're good. We have a really large API that can be a pain to write out those files. And there is a project in a sandbox on Drupal.org where somebody made an attempt to export services resources into the XML file and Apogee accepts. The status of that was left blocked.
One more.
Sure,
thought.
go ahead.
Will any of those services traverse hypermedia links or whatever within your responses, like so that you don't have to tell them where to go find the endpoints? They could just navigate and discover that.
So the question was, will any of those services traverse hyperlinks or data inside of your responses so they can discover things on their own?
Apogee wouldn't. You would still need to be able to provide all the XML files to map different functions that you might want to provide. So your XML file will actually say this is the format that we expect to get request. This is the format that we expect a post request to these different resources, and list out all the parameters. So there is no built-in way to just provide.
It's too good to be true.
Yeah, someday.
You haven't mentioned anything about caching yet. Which do these third-party services provided, and what Drupal modules cache request?
So the question was, you haven't provided any information about caching yet, so I'm not going to rub it in, but caching, yes, they do provide caching. The third-party services, caching is one of the best things that they provide. If you're not using a third-party service, this works with a Drupal cache too. So whatever you're using Drupal cache, or you've got memcache on top of it, or you're caching with APC, it's going to work inside of the Drupal stack.
But you might imagine that developers are going to make a number of queries to your API. So not only might they change their offset or limit requirements, they could change the title parameters, they could change the body parameters, and each of those individual requests would get cached. But if you're expecting a lot of developers to use your application, you're probably going to still see a lot of fortune hits.
Yeah, and something you can get from the third-party providers is the ability to throttle also, so you can set thresholds for the maximum number of requests in a certain amount of time from a certain user. Another thing that they also handle that I didn't mention is the whole, having API keys. So I guess that's part of authentication, but you can throttle per API key and blacklist and whitelist and do all of those sorts of things that you're going to want to do.
And since we're still talking about the providers, 3Scale has a really great free tier. So you can get something like 1.5 million requests per month through 3Scale's free tier, and their pricing structure is pretty straightforward moving forward.
Services have any kind of API key management?
So the question was, does services have any API key management? It has the built-in Drupal authentication. It doesn't have API key management, but if you want to use Drupal users and have them authenticate with usernames and passwords, you can do that.
It is pretty easy to write your own module that services uses to authenticate with.
There's one out there.
Is there?
Yeah, I've used it before, but from what I remember, it's a little.
We just released an OAuth 2 server module like last month.
Any other questions?
Yeah, when we think about actually internalize it, we have questions like that.
You guys can come find us and ask us questions if you'd like, or email us, or
Lobster.
tweet at us, or whatever.
I'm not going to check my Twitter.
The slides on your blog.
Excuse me?
Did you put these slides on your blog?
Yeah, so the question was, are we going to put these slides up online? I don't know. I'm kind of assuming CapitalCamp has a place for us to put this, and we'll...
They're already there, but they're already out of date. They're sort of out of date.
Okay, so we'll make sure it gets updated there. If you guys want to look at my blog, it's grasmash.com. It's on Drupal Planet, Grasmash, and I can put it on there too. He's got a blog.
I'm not going to update it.
No? Okay. Man, you're very unaccommodating.
Grasmash what?
Com. So, anyone else? Okay, great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.